Welcome to Tied to the Moon, a podcast about yearning and learning to live with the rhythms of nature. My name is Kate Lawrence and I am your host. If you're enjoying this podcast and feel like buying me a coffee, it's a metaphorical one, not a literal one, as a token of your appreciation, I would be thrilled. You can't imagine, or maybe you can, how such a gesture means and conveys more than the sum of the cents that make it up. It's a really simple way of supporting an independent creator, and you can then call yourself a benefactor of the arts. Or maybe not. Anyway, the link is on the website storyground.com.au. This is episode 2 in a special 3-part series for the Winter Solstice here in the Southern Hemisphere, and obviously the Summer Solstice if you're listening in the Northern Hemisphere. The series is focused on the story of Joan of Arc. In the last episode, I gave some background as to how I came to perform this story, and we heard the first part of the story. And now, in this episode, we're going to hear the rest of the story of Joan of Arc. Or if you're listening to this after the 21st of June, 2022, you can listen to the whole story in one play as a bonus episode published on the Winter Solstice. But whatever the case, here is a précis of where we're up to in the story of Joan of Arc. Joan begins hearing voices from God at the age of 13, and by the time she's 17, the voices are insistent. She is to lead Charles to be crowned King of France and to lead the army to rid France of the English, because at this time the English are pushing hard with their plans to conquer France, and they have the town of Orleans surrounded. So Joan goes to the nearby Armagnac town to where she lives, and she manages to get the support of the captain to make the 500-kilometre trek across enemy country to the royal court of Charles, who is seen by the Armagnacs as the rightful king of France. She makes the journey safely to the royal court, but Charles is unsure whether to trust her, so he sends her to be questioned by the religious clerics in Poitiers. They decide she might be legit, but they want a sign from God, to be sure. So they set her the task of leading the army to free the town of Orleans. And in great drama and style, Joan does just that. And we pick up the story after the siege is over and the English have retreated. Joan returns to the royal court of Chinon a hero. But she is not finished. She has a mission to rid the whole of France of the English and to see Charles the Dauphin crowned the rightful king in Reims. Reims is a town 400 kilometres north of Chinon in the middle of English-held enemy territory. And it is at the Cathedral of Reims where every king of France since Clovis, the first king of France, has been crowned and anointed with the sacred oil. And so Joan starts to try to persuade Charles to go on this journey with her, but he is as adverse to risk and danger as Joan is ready for it. I'm not so sure about this. It's a bit risky, isn't it? Why don't we just wait until we win the war? Or I don't know, there's an agreement made and I can go to Reims protected. But he's also deeply insecure about his position, and he desperately wants to be given the legitimacy of being crowned king. So eventually, Joan, with her vision and her persuasion, convinces him, and they set off on the 400-kilometre journey. And town after town after town opened their gates to Joan the Maid and her vision to see the Dauphin crowned the rightful king of France. And they get to Reims, and it's a small affair, but the Archbishop of Reims anoints Charles with the sacred oil, and Joan stands behind him with her banner held high and he is crowned king. At this height in Joan's favour with the king declares that Domremy, Joan's home village, will be exempt from taxes in perpetuity. And so for 350 years, the people of Domremy do not pay tax until the French Revolution. But Charles the King is still the dilly-dallying, risk-averse diplomat that he always was, and he heads back to Chinon, despite the fact that Joan wants to fight. She wants to fulfill her prophecy and rid France of the English. That is her God-given mission. That is the direction from her voices. But she must obey her king and go with him. But she is vocal about her frustrations, very vocal, and she's becoming a problem that won't quietly go away. Joan is bordering on usurping royal power and fast becoming a right royal pain in the proverbial. So they send her out to this skirmish and to chase after this renegade or to deal with this mercenary to keep her occupied and out of the court. And finally they sent her to Compiègne. Compiègne is an Armagnac town under attack from the Burgundians. She knows what to do. It's like Orleans. Charge in, God will deliver. But this time, she is surrounded. They press in. There's no way to escape. She is yanked off her horse hard onto the ground. They stand over her and they whoop in triumph. As a knight should, Joan immediately surrenders herself to the nearest Burgundian captain. And then the English rub their hands with glee. At last we have caught the Armagnac whore, and that means that God is not on the side of the Armagnacs, but is on the side of the English and the Burgundians. And we will prove that she is a witch and a heretic, and that will prove that Charles is not the rightful king of France at all. The Armagnacs, for their part, decide that the very fact that Charles has been crowned king at Reims and anointed with the sacred oil is proof positive that he is the rightful king of France. And nothing that Joan did or didn't do, nothing the English prove or don't prove, alter that fact. Charles VII did not once, then or ever, offer a ransom or enter into any negotiations for the release of the woman who turned the tide of the war against the English and saw him crowned king. So the English set out to conduct the most meticulous and rigorous trial that the Middle Ages would see. They would leave no stone unturned to make sure that everything is strictly lawful in the trial, and they will prove without a shadow of a doubt that this woman is a witch and a heretic. It takes them 8 months to bring this trial to a public hearing, and then Joan of Arc, 19, illiterate, faces public interrogation by between 40 and 70 men. Most are double her age. All are vastly more powerful and educated than she is. They are lawyers, theologians, judges, clerics. She might be illiterate, but she is deeply grounded in her faith and articulate. In 6 long sessions stretched out over 2 weeks, they don't get from her what they want. And so they adjourn, and they decide they'll continue the hearings in her prison cell. Naturally, they can't fit 70 men in there, but they can cram about a dozen of them into that dark, dank, cold cell where she's shackled hand and foot. And there, soft and hard, cajoling and menacing, they duck and weave and trip and trick to try to break her resolve. Like hounds with the scent of fox in their nostrils, they barrage her. And finally, she gives them something that they seize upon. She talks of an angel walking upstairs with a crown for the king. And they all know All those lawyers and bishops know that visions from God are ethereal. They don't walk upstairs and they don't carry crowns. Visions like this are the work of the devil. But still they want more. They want Joan to submit to the authority of the church. And so they leave her languishing for another 2 weeks, and then they come back. By this stage, she's sick. She's been in prison for 10 months, 2 months under intense interrogation. She's comforted by the voices of St. Catherine and St. Margaret, but she's said way more than she ever wanted to about her visions, the voices, and her relationship with God. She's also comforted by her tunic and her doublet that are tied around her in elaborate knots to keep the groping, menacing, predatory hands of the men she is surrounded by, who are her captors. She is sure God's help will come. They enter again, and the bishop demands, "Will you submit to the church militant here on earth, to the Holy Mother Church in Rome?" It is to the church and God victorious in heaven that I submit. It seems to me that God and the church are one in the same, and there should be no difficulty with that. Why do you make this such a difficulty? They leave and they come back again 2 weeks later, and this time they take her out to a room full of the implements of torture. Jagged metal teeth, beds of barbs, racks and screws. And she says, "Truly, if you were to tear me limb from limb, if you were to separate my soul from my body, I would tell you no more." The next time they take her to a scaffold erected over the graves in the cemetery of Rouen. And there is the executioner and a sea of men to berate and cajole, to convince and persuade her. And finally the bishop says, "You leave the church no choice but to abandon you to the secular power to be burned at the stake in the purifying fires." And a wave of terror steals through her and she speaks, "I submit. I wish to obey the church and her judges." And they fall about themselves, slathering at the mouth to get her to sign her abjuration, her confession, which will result in her perpetual incarceration. They take her back to her cell. She bows her head. They shave her hair. They give her women's clothes. But 3 days later, the judges are called back, and they come and she's agitated, she's distressed, but they see none of that. All they see is that she is back in men's clothes, and she says, "It is only right and proper that I wear men's clothes if I am to live among men. And what of the promise that I would have mass, and I would be removed from these shackles? I would rather die than live in irons." "Have you heard the voices of St. Catherine and St. Margaret?" "Yes." "And what did they say?" "They said, I have done a great evil, that I have damned myself to save my life." She was declared a relapsed heretic and sentenced to burn at the stake. The next day, as she had been wanting to for so long, Brother Martin came and heard her confession, and he administered the sacrament of the Eucharist. And then they put a tall white hat on her shaved head. The hat read, "Relapsed heretic, apostate, adulterer." And they put her in a cart and they jerked her through the streets of Rouen to the pyre and the marketplace, and there she endured more lectures. "You, Joan the maid, have fallen. You have returned to your sin like a dog to its vomit. Hardened heretics must be separated lest their pernicious vipers lodge in the bosom of the Holy Mother Church." The English soldiers lifted her slender body to the stake and they tied her to it. And then they moved back, and the executioner moved in and lit the pyre. Joan's eyes fixed on a crucifix that someone held high in the crowd for her, and her lips moved in ceaseless prayer. Jesus, Mary, Mother of God, Jesus, Mary, Mother of God, Jesus, Mary, Mother of God, Jesus, 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 Jesus. They say her head slumped in unconsciousness before the flames reached her. And then, once they had, the executioner raked back the fire so that all could see and satisfy themselves that she was a woman. Joan of Arc's public life was for 2 years. The first year she was a soldier, the second year she was a prisoner. Her courage, her faith and vision in the face of unfathomable differences in power, in gender, rank, education, age, they'll always be extraordinary and inspiring. The power of her imagination enabled her to envision a France that was not in living memory, a France free of the invading English. And she saw clearly the means and the need to have the Dauphin crowned the rightful king of France. Her youthful, impetuous, abstinent, glorious life draws from me a desire to honour and support the willful, visionary, compelling young women of today. Unlike them, Joan did not have the luxury of time and maturing. Her sins cascaded around her. She heard voices, she fought like a soldier, she dressed like a man, she cowed before no one. But most heinous of all, she refused to submit to the church and claimed for herself direct communication with God, a particularly pagan view of the divine. The Roman Catholic Church spent the next 400 years in trials and torture, persecution and murder, mostly directed at women, to make sure that no one else claimed a direct line to God. And the legacy of that violence over all those years is still with us today. But so too is the legacy of the story of Joan of Arc. Next episode of Tied to the Moon will complete the Joan of Arc trilogy with an exploration of how I went about crafting this story as an oral story and how I make sense of Joan's story in my own life. Thanks for listening to Tied to the Moon. If you like this podcast, please rate and review it on iTunes or wherever you listen, and tell other people about it. And if you have any ideas, suggestions, requests, comments or feedback, I would love to hear from you. You can find the show notes and contact details at storyground.com.au. Theme music for this podcast is by Danya from Audio Jungle. This podcast is a production of Storyground and me, Kate Lawrence, and it's made on the traditional lands of the Gunung Willem Balak at the foot of Mount Macedon, 65 kilometres northwest of Melbourne, Australia.